The rain fell in thick sheets across the city that December night, turning sidewalks into rivers and streetlights into blurred halos. Thomas Anderson pulled his threadbare jacket tighter as he hurried home from his second job at the warehouse. His weathered hands, pale from years of working night shifts, ached from the cold. That's when he saw her, a small figure huddled beneath the broken awning of a closed shop, knees drawn to her chest, expensive dress soaked through. Without thinking, he shrugged off his jacket and wrapped it around her trembling shoulders. Thomas knelt beside the girl, who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Her designer shoes were ruined, her dark hair plastered to her face, but it was her eyes that stopped him cold. They held a loneliness he recognized too well. The street light illuminated his concerned face, his blue eyes crinkling with worry. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said gently, rain streaming down his face. "What are you doing out here all alone?" She looked up at him with those haunted eyes and whispered something he couldn't hear over the storm. Thomas didn't ask again. Instead, he held out his calloused hand. "Come on, let's get you somewhere warm." The girl hesitated for only a moment before placing her small hand in his. Thomas lifted her into his arms, surprised by how light she felt, how easily she curled against his chest as if she'd been waiting for someone to carry her away from the cold. He didn't notice the gold bracelet on her wrist or the monogrammed initials on her ruined dress. All he saw was a child who needed help, and 30 years of living paycheck to paycheck hadn't stripped him of his humanity. His sandy hair, now streaked with premature gray from stress and loss, dripped steadily as he adjusted her weight in his arms. His apartment was only 3 blocks away, but it felt like miles as he carried her through the storm. She buried her face in his shoulder, her tears mixing with the rain. Thomas hummed an old lullaby his mother used to sing, the same one he'd hummed to his own daughter years ago, before the accident took her and his wife away. It was an Irish tune his grandmother had brought from the old country, a melody that seemed to transcend language and comfort the girl. By the time they reached his building, she'd stopped shaking quite so hard. The apartment was small, just 2 rooms and a kitchenette, but Thomas kept it clean and warm. The walls held faded photographs of better times. A younger Thomas with his arms around a laughing blonde woman, a little girl with his same blue eyes grinning gap-toothed at the camera. He set the girl down gently on his worn couch and grabbed every towel he owned. "There we go," he said, wrapping her up like a burrito. "Better?" She nodded, those big eyes taking in everything. The peeling wallpaper he'd been meaning to fix, the photographs on the mantel, the stack of overdue bills on the coffee table he quickly flipped face down. "Are you hungry?" Thomas asked, already moving to the kitchen. He didn't have much payday, wasn't until Friday, but he had a box of mac and cheese and some milk that was still good. The girl watched him work, her silence heavy with something more than shyness. As the pasta boiled, Thomas kept up a gentle stream of chatter, talking about nothing important: the weather, his neighbor's cat that liked to steal socks, the funny way the radiator clanged like it was singing opera. Anything to fill the quiet and make her feel safe. When he set the steaming bowl in front of her, she stared at it like she'd never seen mac and cheese before. "It's not fancy," Thomas apologized, suddenly aware of how simple it must seem. But the girl picked up the spoon with both hands and took a careful bite, then another. Then she was eating like she hadn't had a meal in days, and Thomas wondered when someone had last cooked for her, had last sat with her while she ate. He poured her a glass of milk and sat across from her, his own bowl untouched as he watched her eat with such focus. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked when she'd finished half the bowl. She paused, spoon halfway to her mouth, and for a moment he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, so quietly, he almost missed it. "Isabella." Thomas smiled, the expression transforming his tired face. "That's a beautiful name. I'm Thomas." She nodded, returning to her mac and cheese, but some of the tension had left her shoulders. "Like from the Bible?" she asked, and he chuckled. "My mom thought so. Said I'd need faith like doubting Thomas. Guess she was right about that." After dinner, Thomas made up the couch with his best sheets, the ones without holes, and found an old t-shirt of his daughter's that he'd kept all these years. It was pink with a faded unicorn on the front, and it swallowed Isabella whole, but she smiled for the first time when she put it on. "My Charlotte would have been about your age," he said softly, then caught himself. But Isabella just looked at him with those knowing eyes and asked, "Where is she?" Thomas sat on the edge of the coffee table, his hands clasped between his knees. The lamplight caught the silver in his hair, making him look older than his 42 years. "She's in heaven," he said simply, "with her mommy." Isabella nodded as if this made perfect sense. My mommy's there too, she whispered. Daddy says she's watching over me, but sometimes I think she forgets. The words hung in the air between them, two broken hearts recognizing each other in the lamplight. You know what I think? Thomas said, moving to sit beside her on the couch. I think mommies in heaven never forget. They just sometimes send us to each other when we need it most. Isabella leaned against his arm, such a small weight but somehow anchoring him to the moment. Will you tell me about Charlotte? She asked. And Thomas found himself sharing stories he hadn't told anyone in years. He talked about Charlotte's first day of school, how she'd insisted on wearing her tutu over her uniform, about the time she'd tried to adopt every stray cat in the neighborhood, declaring their apartment a cat sanctuary and making little beds out of shoe boxes, about her laugh that sounded like wind chimes, and her stubborn streak a mile wide just like her mother's. Isabella listened with the focus of someone storing up memories, occasionally asking questions that showed she understood more about loss than any child should. Did she like mac and cheese too? Isabella asked, and Thomas laughed, a real laugh that surprised them both. She loved it, called it golden pasta, and insisted it was what princesses ate for dinner. Isabella's eyes widened. Really? Thomas nodded solemnly. Really, said she read it in a very important princess book. Isabella giggled, the sound filling the small apartment like music. I think Charlotte was smart, she declared, and Thomas felt his eyes burn with unshed tears. As the night wore on and the rain continued its assault on the windows, Isabella's eyes grew heavy. Thomas tucked the blankets around her, his movements practiced even after all these years. The familiar ritual brought back a flood of memories, Charlotte asking for one more story, one more glass of water, one more kiss, good night. Thomas? Isabella said sleepily. Yeah, sweetheart. Do you think Charlotte would have liked me? The question squeezed his heart. I know she would have, he said, smoothing her damp hair. You would have been best friends. Isabella smiled and closed her eyes. Will you stay until I fall asleep? Thomas settled into the armchair beside the couch, his long legs cramped in the small space. I'll be right here, he promised. All night if you need me. And he meant it. As her breathing evened out, Thomas watched her sleep, this mysterious child who'd appeared in his life like a gift from the storm. For the first time in years, his apartment didn't feel empty. The ghost that usually haunted these walls seemed to rest, as if Charlotte herself approved of this small act of kindness. He must have dozed off because he woke to the first pale light of dawn filtering through the worn curtains. Isabella was still asleep, curled into a tiny ball beneath the blankets. Thomas stood slowly, his back protesting from the night in the chair, and made his way to the kitchen. He'd make her a real breakfast eggs if he had any, toast with the last of the jam. She deserved more than leftover mac and cheese. As he searched his meager supplies, he didn't hear the first knock at the door. The second knock, however, was impossible to ignore, loud, authoritative, demanding. Morning had come too soon, bringing with it a chaos Thomas couldn't have imagined. He opened the door to find the hallway filled with men in dark suits, speaking into earpieces, a woman in designer clothes with Isabella's dark eyes, and behind them, photographers already raising cameras. The flashes were blinding, and Thomas instinctively moved to block their view of the apartment, of Isabella still sleeping peacefully on his couch. Isabella, the woman pushed past Thomas, gathering the girl into her arms. Oh my God, baby, we've been looking everywhere. The entire city's been searching. She held Isabella at arm's length, checking for injuries, then hugged her again. Over Isabella's head, her eyes found Thomas, sharp and assessing. They took in his rumpled appearance, his work-worn hands, the modest apartment behind him. You're the one who found her? Thomas nodded, confused by the circus in his hallway. Mrs. Chen from next door was peering out, and he could hear other neighbors gathering. She was caught in the storm, he said simply. I couldn't leave her there. The woman stood, Isabella's hand clutched in hers, and Thomas saw her take in his small apartment, his work clothes draped over a chair, the empty mac and cheese box still on the counter. Her perfectly manicured nails contrasted sharply with Isabella's small fingers. Do you have any idea who she is? The woman asked, and there was something in her tone that made Thomas straighten. Despite his humble circumstances, there was dignity in the way he held himself, a quiet strength that came from surviving loss. She said her name was Isabella, he replied. That's all I needed to know. The woman's expression shifted, surprise flickering across her features. I'm Margaret Sinclair, she said, Isabella's stepmother. Her father is William Sinclair. The name hit Thomas like a physical blow. Everyone knew William Sinclair. His face was on half the buildings downtown. His companies employed thousands. The Sinclair Foundation donated millions to causes across the city. And this little girl who'd eaten mac and cheese at his scratch table and fallen asleep to stories about his daughter was heir to billions. Thomas looked at Isabella, who was staring at the floor, and understood why she'd seemed so lost. Money couldn't buy what she'd been looking for. Mr. Margaret waited for his name. Anderson. Thomas Anderson. She nodded, already reaching for her designer purse. Mr. Anderson, I cannot begin to thank you. Isabella's father is in Tokyo, but he's flying back immediately. Of course, we'll compensate you for your trouble number. The word came out sharper than Thomas intended. No money. I didn't help her for money. His blue eyes were firm, resolute, the same look he'd had when he'd made the decision to work 2 jobs rather than accept charity after Sarah and Charlotte died. Margaret blinked, clearly not used to being refused. Behind her, one of the suits stepped forward. Sir, Mr. Sinclair insists. I don't care what Mr. Sinclair insists, Thomas said quietly. I helped a little girl who needed help. That's it. He looked at Isabella, who had finally raised her eyes to meet his. You take care of yourself, sweetheart. Remember what we talked about, your mommy's always watching. Isabella pulled free from Margaret's grip and ran to Thomas, throwing her arms around his waist. I wish you were my daddy, she whispered against his worn t-shirt, words meant only for him. You would never forget me. Thomas's throat closed as he hugged her back, this little billionaire who just wanted someone to remember she existed. I won't forget you either, he promised. Her small arms tightened around him, and he could feel her tears soaking through his shirt. Margaret gently pulled Isabella away, her expression unreadable. We should go, she said softly. Your father's worried sick. As they moved toward the door, Isabella looked back one more time. Bye, Thomas, she said. And then they were gone, leaving only the echo of expensive shoes on cheap linoleum and the lingering scent of Margaret's perfume. The circus followed them out, suits, photographers, neighbors whispering behind hands. Thomas closed his door and leaned against it, the apartment suddenly too quiet again. On the couch, the indent where Isabella had slept was still visible. He sat down heavily, picking up the blanket that still smelled faintly of her strawberry shampoo, and wondered if he'd dreamed the whole thing. The pink unicorn shirt lay folded on the arm of the couch she'd changed back into her dress before leaving, but the sight of that small shirt made everything real. But the empty mac and cheese box was real, the towels thrown in the hamper were real, and the ache in his chest, the feeling that he'd held something precious and let it go, that was real too. Thomas looked at Charlotte's photo on the mantel and almost smiled. You would have liked her, baby girl, he said to the empty room. She needed someone to see her, just like you always saw everyone. The morning sun caught the photo, making Charlotte's blonde hair shine, and for a moment, Thomas could almost hear her giggle. The next few days passed in a blur of normalcy that felt anything but normal. Thomas went to work, came home, paid what bills he could, and tried not to think about a little girl eating mac and cheese at his table. But the world, it seemed, had other plans. The story had leaked mysterious Sinclair heiress found with blue-collar worker, and suddenly Thomas couldn't buy milk without someone staring. His face, captured by those photographers, was on every gossip site in the city. His supervisor at the warehouse pulled him aside on Thursday. Anderson, we need to talk. The conversation was short and brutal. The company couldn't afford the attention, the disruption. They'd mail his last check. Thomas packed his locker in silence, 20 years of loyalty fitting into a cardboard box. The other workers avoided his eyes, afraid that whatever he had might be contagious. Tom, who'd worked beside him for a decade, muttered a quiet sorry, man, but wouldn't meet his gaze. His evening job at the diner lasted 2 more days before the owner, apologetic but firm, told him the customers were uncomfortable. It's not personal, Thomas, she said, not meeting his eyes. But people talk, and in this economy, Thomas understood. He'd lived close to the edge long enough to know that reputation was sometimes all people like them had, and his had been complicated by proximity to wealth. He hung up his apron for the last time, the familiar weight of it feeling like another loss. The whispers followed him everywhere. At the grocery store, people speculated about what had really happened that night. Online, though, Thomas barely used the internet. Theories ranged from kidnapping to an elaborate con. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd refused money, but everyone assumed he was playing a longer game. Even Mrs. Chen looked at him differently now, suspicion replacing years of neighborly warmth. The Korean grandmother who used to share her kimchi now barely nodded in the hallway. A week after Isabella had left, Thomas sat at his kitchen table with his calculator and his bills, trying to make numbers work that had never quite worked before, and certainly wouldn't now. Unemployment would help, but not enough. He'd have to move, find somewhere cheaper, start over again. He'd done it before, after Sarah and Charlotte died. He could do it again. The knowledge sat like lead in his stomach. His hands, still bearing the calluses from years of honest work, trembled slightly as he wrote down the figures. That's when the knock came soft, almost hesitant. Thomas opened the door expecting another reporter, but found instead a young man in an expensive suit holding an envelope. "Mr. Anderson? I've been asked to deliver this personally." He handed over the envelope and left before Thomas could refuse it. Inside was a card with an address and a time, nothing more. The paper was heavy, expensive, the kind that made a whisper sound when you touched it. The address was in the part of town where Thomas only went to clean offices. He almost threw it away. Whatever game the Sinclairs were playing, he wanted no part of it. But something, maybe the memory of Isabella's whispered wish, maybe just curiosity, made him pocket the card. He held it up to the light, studying the elegant calligraphy, wondering what could be worth the risk of more public humiliation. 3 days later, wearing his only good shirt and fighting every instinct that told him to turn around, Thomas took 2 buses to reach the towering glass building at the address. The lobby was all marble and hushed voices, the kind of place that made him hyper-aware of his worn shoes and calloused hands. Other visitors glided past in designer suits, their footsteps muffled by carpet that probably cost more than his yearly rent. "I'm Thomas Anderson," he told the receptionist, expecting to be turned away. Instead, she smiled warmly. "Of course, Mr. Anderson. They're expecting you. 20th floor, please." The elevator ride seemed endless, his reflection in the mirrored walls looking as out of place as he felt a working man's face lined with grief and hard labor, pale skin that rarely saw vacation sunshine. The elevator opened not into an office but into a penthouse apartment that seemed to float above the city. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a view Thomas had only seen in movies, and for a moment he forgot to breathe. The space was larger than his entire apartment building, decorated in whites and creams that seemed to glow in the afternoon light. Then he heard a familiar laugh and turned to see Isabella racing toward him, her face bright with joy. "Thomas, you came. I knew you'd come." She crashed into him with the force of her happiness, and Thomas caught her automatically, lifting her into a hug. His strong arms, built from years of warehouse work, held her easily. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said, his voice rough. "You look good. Fancy dress and everything." Isabella made a face. "Margaret makes me wear them. But look." She pulled him by the hand through rooms that could have fit his entire apartment building, chattering nonstop about everything and nothing. Her excitement was infectious, and Thomas found himself smiling despite his discomfort. They ended up in what Isabella called her playroom, though it looked more like a toy store. Every imaginable toy lined the shelves, untouched and somehow sad in their perfection. The room was bigger than most people's houses, with a ceiling painted to look like the sky and furniture that belonged in a palace. "Do you want to play?" Isabella asked, but there was something in her voice that made Thomas kneel to her level. "What do you really want to do?" he asked, and her face crumpled just a little. "I don't know how," she admitted. "No one ever taught me." So Thomas taught her. They built block towers and knocked them down, Isabella shrieking with delight each time the blocks scattered. They had tea parties with stuffed animals who all had opinions about cookies. Mr. Elephant preferred chocolate chip, while Lady Giraffe insisted on snickerdoodles. They made up stories about brave princesses who saved themselves and kind dragons who just wanted friends. For the first time since he'd arrived, Isabella seemed like the 8-year-old she was supposed to be, not a tiny adult in designer clothes. Thomas's patience, honed by years with Charlotte, never wavered as he showed her how to balance blocks and pour imaginary tea. "Isabella?" A man's voice came from the doorway, and Thomas looked up to see William Sinclair himself. In person, he was smaller than his billboard suggested, and there was something hollow in his eyes as he watched his daughter play. He was younger than Thomas had expected, maybe late 30s, with the kind of carefully maintained appearance that spoke of personal trainers and expensive skincare. "Daddy," Isabella said, but she didn't run to him. "This is Thomas. He's teaching me to play blocks. Did you know they can be castles or spaceships or anything?" William moved into the room slowly, like he was entering foreign territory. "I didn't know that," he admitted. He looked at Thomas, and there was no hostility there, just a kind of bewildered gratitude. "She hasn't played like this, ever, I think." Thomas stood, suddenly aware of the toy blocks in his hands. "Every kid should know how to play," he said simply. The two men studied each other, one polished and powerful, the other weathered and genuine, finding an unexpected understanding in their shared loss of wives, their love for daughters. "Daddy, can Thomas come every day?" Isabella asked, and the hope in her voice was painful. William glanced at Thomas, then back at his daughter. "That's up to Mr. Anderson, sweetheart." But Thomas was already shaking his head. "I don't think that's a good idea," he said gently. "Your daddy can play blocks with you. I bet he'd be really good at making castles." He placed the blocks in William's uncertain hands, showing him the basic technique. "See, just like this. Isabella can teach you the rest." Isabella's face fell, but before anyone could respond, Margaret appeared. "William, the reporters are here for the foundation interview." Oh. She stopped, taking in the scene, her stepdaughter on the floor with blocks, her husband looking lost, and Thomas standing like he was ready to bolt. "Mr. Anderson," she said carefully, "I didn't know you were coming." Her perfect composure wavered slightly at the domestic scene before her. "I invited him," Isabella said, a note of defiance in her voice. "He's my friend." Margaret and William exchanged a look Thomas couldn't read. "Of course," Margaret said finally. "But darling, we have commitments today. Perhaps Mr. Anderson could come another time?" The dismissal was polite but clear. Thomas grabbed his jacket, ignoring Isabella's protests. "I should go anyway," he said. The familiar weight of class differences settled on his shoulders like an old coat. But as he headed for the elevator, Isabella caught his hand. "You'll come back, right? You promised you wouldn't forget me." Thomas knelt one more time, memorizing her face. His rough hand gently touched her cheek. "I never break a promise," he said, "but sometimes grown-ups can't visit as much as they want to. That doesn't mean they forget." She nodded solemnly, understanding too much again. "Like mommy's in heaven," she said, and Thomas's heart cracked a little more. The elevator ride down felt like descending from another world. By the time Thomas reached the lobby, he'd convinced himself it would be the last time he'd see her. The Sinclairs would close ranks, protect their daughter from complicated entanglements with unemployed warehouse workers. It was for the best. Isabella needed stability, not a reminder of the night she'd run away. He was halfway to the bus stop when his phone rang a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Anderson? This is Margaret Sinclair. Please don't hang up." Thomas stopped walking, pressing the phone to his ear. "I'm listening." There was a pause then. "Isabella hasn't been the same since that night. Not in a bad way, in a good way. She talks about you constantly. She ate mac and cheese for the first time in her life yesterday and declared it the best food ever. She built a blanket fort in her room because you told her about doing that with Charlotte." Margaret's voice, usually so controlled, cracked slightly on the last word. Thomas closed his eyes, seeing Charlotte's elaborate fort constructions that had taken over their entire living room. "Mrs. Sinclair, she needs you," Margaret interrupted. "I don't understand it, and frankly, it scares me a little. But she needs you, and I think maybe you need her too." The words hung between them, truth too heavy for a phone call. "What are you suggesting?" Thomas asked finally. The October wind cut through his thin jacket, but he barely noticed. "Come to dinner tomorrow," Margaret said. "Just dinner. We can figure out the rest later." Thomas wanted to say no. Every instinct screamed that this would end badly, that worlds this different didn't merge without casualties. But he thought of Isabella's face when she'd asked if Charlotte would have liked her, and heard himself saying, "Okay, dinner." Margaret's relief was audible. 7 o'clock. "I'll send a car. I'll take the bus," Thomas said firmly. "Okay," Margaret said, and he could hear her smile. "Take the bus." The next few weeks fell into a pattern Thomas couldn't have predicted. Dinners became twice-weekly visits. Visits became Saturdays at the park, teaching Isabella to ride a bike she'd owned for 2 years but never used. He helped with homework at a kitchen table that cost more than his yearly salary, making math problems into stories about brave knights and clever princesses who always knew their multiplication tables. His patient teaching style, developed through years of helping Charlotte, made learning feel like play. William began joining them sometimes, awkward at first but genuinely trying. Thomas watched him learn to play with his daughter, saw the wonder on his face when Isabella laughed at his silly voices during story time. "I've been a terrible father," William said one evening while Isabella was getting ready for bed. "I thought providing everything meant I was doing enough." Thomas shook his head. "You're here now. That's what matters." The two men sat in comfortable silence, both understanding the weight of second chances. But the media attention never fully died. Photos surfaced of Thomas pushing Isabella on swings, of the three of them at a food truck because Isabella wanted to try street tacos. The headlines were predictable. Billionaire's daughter's new best friend, heartwarming or calculated. The speculation grew uglier as Thomas continued to refuse any form of payment, any official position. If he wasn't after money, what was his game? His weathered face and work clothes stood out starkly against the Sinclair's polished world in every photograph. The breaking point came at a charity gala Thomas hadn't wanted to attend. Margaret had insisted Isabella's being honored for her reading program donation. "She wants you there," and Thomas had worn his funeral suit, hoping to blend into the background. But whispers followed him through the glittering crowd. He heard fragments, convenient timing, obviously coached, playing the long game. His pale skin flushed with embarrassment and anger as he navigated the sea of judgment. Thomas was refilling his water glass when he overheard two women by the champagne fountain. "That's him," one said, not bothering to lower her voice. "Can you imagine using a child like that? At least have the dignity to take the money up front." Her companion laughed. "Maybe he's holding out for adoption. Instant inheritance." The words hit Thomas like physical blows. He set down his glass and headed for the exit, his hands shaking with suppressed rage and hurt. But Isabella found him first, tugging on his sleeve. "Thomas, they're going to call me up soon. You'll watch, right?" He looked down at her hopeful face, this little girl who'd become so dear to him, and nodded. "Wouldn't miss it, sweetheart." So he stayed, standing at the back while Isabella received her award, her young voice clear as she talked about wanting to help kids who didn't have books at home. Then she went off script. "I want to thank my friend Thomas," she said into the microphone. "He taught me that the best stories aren't in books, they're in the people who read them to you. He reads to me every week, and he does voices for all the characters. He's not trying to be my dad, he already is." The ballroom went silent. Thomas felt every eye turned to him, some hostile, some curious, most skeptical. But Isabella was beaming at him from the stage, and that was all that mattered. His eyes, the same blue as a winter sky, filled with tears he refused to shed in public. Later, in the car Margaret had insisted on, Isabella fell asleep against Thomas's shoulder. "She's never said that before," Margaret said quietly from the front seat. "About you being—" She trailed off. Thomas stroked Isabella's hair gently. "I know what people think," he said. "I know how it looks. Maybe it would be better if I—" "Don't," Margaret interrupted. "Don't you dare. I've watched you with her. William has watched you. We know what this is, even if they don't." The car pulled up to Thomas's building, but before he could get out, Margaret turned around. "William and I have been talking. We want to make this official. Not adoption, that's not what anyone wants, but legal guardianship, scheduled time, rights." Thomas stared at her. "Why would you do that?" Margaret smiled sadly. "Because money can't buy what you give her, and because she's teaching us through you. We're learning to be the parents she needs, but she needs you too." Thomas looked down at Isabella, still sleeping peacefully. "I need to think about it," he said finally. Margaret nodded. "Of course. But Thomas? The world's going to talk regardless. Might as well give them something real to talk about." As he carried Isabella up to the Sinclair's penthouse one more time, Thomas thought about families, how they formed in unexpected ways, how love didn't always follow bloodlines or bank accounts. The guardianship papers were signed on a rainy Tuesday that reminded Thomas of that first night. The ceremony was small, just family, which somehow included him now. Isabella wore a simple dress at her own insistence and held both Thomas's hand and her father's as the judge made it official. She hyphenated her name that day, becoming Isabella Sinclair Anderson, carrying both families forward. Thomas's hand shook as he signed his name, this white-collar formality so different from any document he'd signed before. The media had a field day, of course. But Thomas had learned to tune them out, focusing instead on what mattered. Isabella's laughter when he taught her to make paper airplanes, William's growing confidence as a father, Margaret's quiet acceptance of this unconventional arrangement. His apartment was still small, but now it regularly hosted sleepovers where a billionaire's daughter ate microwave popcorn and watched old movies on his second-hand television. The contrast never stopped being surreal, but somehow it worked. He'd found work again, nothing fancy, but honest, and refused the trust fund William tried to establish. "I'm not her parent for money," he said for the 100th time. "I know," William replied. "That's why you're her parent." The logic was circular, but somehow made sense in their strange new normal. Isabella thrived with her extended family, secure in the knowledge that she was loved in both penthouses and tiny apartments. 6 months after that first rainy night, they all sat around Thomas's scratched table, eating spaghetti he'd made from scratch. Isabella was telling a convoluted story about her day at school, gesturing wildly and nearly knocking over her juice. William was actually laughing real laughter, not the polished society version. Margaret was sneaking garlic bread when she thought no one was looking. And Thomas realized this was what family looked like: messy, imperfect, bound by choice rather than chance. "Thomas?" Isabella said suddenly, mid-story. "Yeah, sweetheart? I'm glad I got lost that night." The table went quiet. Thomas reached over and squeezed her hand. "Me too," he said. "Me too." Outside, rain began to fall again, but inside the small apartment there was warmth and laughter and the kind of wealth that couldn't be deposited in any bank. They'd all been lost in their own ways that night. But sometimes, Thomas thought, watching his unlikely family share a simple meal, sometimes getting lost was the only way to find your way home. Later, after dishes were done and Isabella was asleep on the couch again, she insisted on sleepovers, at least once a week. William and Thomas stood by the window watching the rain. "Thank you," William said quietly. "For what?" Thomas asked. "For showing me that being a father isn't about what you can give, it's about showing up." Thomas nodded, thinking of Charlotte, of all the showing up he'd never gotten to do. "She's teaching all of us," he said. The two men stood shoulder to shoulder, so different in background but united in purpose. And she was. In boardrooms, William now made time for evening stories. Margaret had learned to bake cookies from scratch, badly but with enthusiasm. And Thomas had learned that family wasn't something you lost and mourned forever, it was something you could build again, one rainy night, one shared meal, one bedtime story at a time. The world would always have its opinions about their arrangement, but in the warmth of a small apartment where love mattered more than money, they'd found something precious. They'd found home. Years later, when people asked Isabella about her unusual family, she would smile and say she had been lucky enough to have two fathers, one who gave her life and one who taught her how to live it. She kept the Sinclair Anderson name through college and beyond, a daily reminder that families weren't built on blood or billions, but on the choice to show up for each other, again and again. And on rainy nights, she still made mac and cheese the way Thomas taught her, what princesses eat for dinner, golden pasta for the soul.